Okay, thank you, Yurt. Thanks, everyone. What a pleasure to be among such a diverse set of speakers. In my presentation, I will somehow try to illuminate a bit some of the questions that were raised before. Negar, for example, question, where is the landscape? And also through Victor's presentation, we saw already some questions about afterkey. Can you bottle the landscape? Can you create like a self-sufficient system, right? And my presentation somehow investigates this and tries to understand the spatial logic of the feedlot, right? And you have a feedlot there in the background, which I will try to understand through this concept of the operational landscape. This is what I will be talking about. I will explain what it is, and I will try to highlight some points that might help us understand the spatial logic of the operational landscape and how it is becoming very important in organizing life on the planet. So I have here just a zoom in of this. This is a dry feedlot in Texas, right? And you can see the cows, right? And finally, you can also see the landscape of the cows. And feedlots like that typically have something like 5,000 to 10,000 animals, right? These are like fattening areas from where you have these cows spending from 3 to 6 months at least for fattening, 3 to 6 months for fattening, and then you move them to the processing facilities, right? And obviously on the right, this pond that you see is the manure pond, right? And it might look very disgusting to us, right? But coming back to the discussion that we had before, Sophia also mentioned it, this is actually how it is supposed to be, right? We don't like it, but someone designed it to be like that. So this is the proper way of feeding these cows, of treating these cows, of having this condition of high productivity of meat production, right? And this is somehow designed, Sophia might help us more understanding how this came up as a design solution over, more than 100 years probably. But my question here is who designed, the broader spatial configuration that allowed this type of landscape to emerge, right? And which is the spatial logic of it? And obviously, you will say, no one designed it, or the market designed it, or it was historical evolution, accident, upscaling of farming operations. I will try to answer this question by placing the feedlot question within the broader logic of urbanization and what it means, right? And the metabolism, the specific metabolism that urbanization suggests. And there is no better starting point, I don't know if you are familiar with this model, than this very old model from the 1850s by the German agriculturalist, economic geographer, Johannes von Thunen, right? Which is his model of the isolated state. I find it very interesting because it addresses a lot of issues that I mentioned already, right? The spatial logic, the isolated space autarky, right? Autonomy in terms of resources. And also, it is completely made up, right? We think that it corresponds to a condition that existed in the past, like this romantic idea that you have the city in the middle or the town, and it has a hinterland around it, right? But this model probably never existed exactly like that, right? It's a theoretical model. These circles that you see around it, that they organize land use around the town, they are not based on any historical observation of how this was, happening on the ground. It is actually just calculated based on transportation costs. So it is a theoretical landscape, and the spatial logic of the landscape is a result of how much it costs to transport stuff to the town according to how heavy they are, how much land they need, and all these things, right? And it's interesting to notice that you have the town. Obviously, you have mining around the town. Okay, we don't care about mining in these panels, right? But then you have this dairy production zone, right, right close to it. Also because it's very difficult to conserve dairy products if you're in the 1850s, right? So they have to be closed because you cannot spend a lot of time. Then you have forestry, weird, but remember that forests are the main source of fuel in the 1850s, and also they are very heavy wood to transport, so you have to have it close. And then you have huge areas of croplands, farming, and the outer zone is grazing, right? Where these cows that are closer to the city are supposed to be grazing, right? So as I said, completely theoretical model, completely abstract geography. he even presents it as a theoretical experiment, and yet I think a lot of discussions that we have today around sustainable food systems, eat local, organize, localized supply chains and things like that, right, seem to somehow reflect this idea, right, that you have something like a town, and around it we have the resource hinterland, this primary economy that supports the metabolism of these people, right? So before I go to the next map, a few interesting things that you might already know in relation to urbanization. This model exists because the city exists, right? The city is why this land use is organized like that. If people were not concentrated in the middle there, in the little town, right, and they would be scattered around it, you would have a completely different form of spatial organization, right? The rings exist because the town exists, right? And the town exists because people concentrate the space. I mean, we won't go into the details of the history of urbanization, right? But people concentrated space, they cannot live off the land, they need to be supported by other people and non-people that are actually working on the land, right? So, if we extrapolate from this model, this is a theoretical model, right? So why not say that the isolated state is the whole planet, right? We have the cities, and then we have these layers, right? We have cropland, you have grazing land, we have the rings of Fontuna, you have the forestry zones, right? And you end up, through all these transportation systems that you end up having something like this relationship, right? That you have population concentrations and you have these variegated landscapes, right? And unfortunately, in this globalized condition that we have today, these landscapes are not so neatly structured hierarchically, right? They are not really following this logic of the hinterland, I would call it, which suggests that you have like this monocentric system, that you have a direct connection that is regional and is quite diverse, right? You have everything around the city, it's sourced, it's somehow self-sufficient, right? The reason is because under planetary urbanization over these 200 years of industrial, capitalist, post-capitalist, post-industrial, whatever you want to call it, urbanization, right? You had a series of transformations really affecting this relationship. I'm trying to summarize here just a few, the ones that I find more relevant for the restructuring of these primary production sectors. So all these sectors that are actually sourcing things out of the ground, forming the material basis of the economy. The first of all is, of course, transportation, right? Also in Fontunen's model, transportation is important. In this case, transportation is somehow limited within this isolated state, but today, transportation is very cheap, right? Of course, it emits a lot of carbon, everyone complains about it, right? But in general, transportation equalizes somehow the opportunities to exchange things across the planet, right? Which also allows cities to grow so much, right? You wouldn't be able to have this kind of population concentrations that we have today unless you were able, through transport, to tap into these very large areas that you can access, right? The second is, of course, transportation without borders is very different than transportation confined within borders, right? So imagine we have almost a century now of liberalization of trade, the increasing integration of new markets into the whole system, right? Although this is starting to be a bit questioned again, and this is an interesting topic to discuss. And also, together with the global international division of labor that we normally associate with manufacturing, like the horizontal production networks of Apple that makes the phones all over the world and then assembles it, right? In the same way, we have the horizontal organization of production systems of the primary sectors of the economy. So the agricultural commodities, mineral commodities, all these things are equally somehow globalized in a horizontal manner, right? Which somehow leads to these forms of regional specialization through the increasing social and natural division of labor. Regional specialization is very important here because it creates these monocultural, monofunctional landscapes that we associate with industrial farming, industrial agriculture. So these large concentrations of animals, these large areas of only cultivating, corn or soybeans are a result of this globalization of these sectors. And one of the reasons is that they are very much dependent upon economies of scale, right? primary economies are very much dependent upon economies of scale to be profitable, right? So I call these landscapes, these specialized production landscapes, operational landscapes, right? And they're kind of globalized. Often they're the result of globalization, but also source of globalization. They're specialized, and most importantly, they are indirectly interlinked, so they don't really feed one particular city or something, right? They are feeding into the whole system of global trade. Example, Union Stockyards in Chicago already, I think this is a picture from right after the war, 47 or something, but this started already emerging in the beginning of the 20th century. You see how many cows you have here collected to be slaughtered, obviously, right? And this is the outline of the whole district. You see that the train lines here, that they're very important because this only became important through the expansion of train routes around Chicago, which you can see here. Right? You will see how radially train lines around Chicago expand and connect it to what eventually became, the Corn Belt area here, right? So you can see how, and this is actually interestingly from Zan Gottman's book on megalopolis, right? How already in the 50s, you have, on the one hand, you have a megalopolitan formation here in the northeast of the United States, right? And at the same time, you have the emergence of these monocultural areas of intense industrialized agricultural production, this operational landscape. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? It's like the new form of the city-hinterland relationship. But how can we really understand this, right? So here is how it looks right now. These are overlays of soybean and corn cultivation. This is, the checkerboard pattern in the whole Midwest of the US. It looks like that. And obviously, this landscape, if we go back to von Thunen's model, it's not really feeding any city, right? It's feeding this other landscape here, right? So this is the hinterland of the concentration of cows, right? So if we go back to this image here of Chicago, the industrial metropolis concentrates people, right? The concentration of people concentrates their sources, their metabolic sources, which create their own hinterlands eventually, right? So we are now looking at the hinterlands of the hinterlands, right? If the cows, the concentrations of the cows need to also have a hinterland of their own, what constructs it and what's the spatial logic? So if we want to now dissect a bit more these maps that I showed you before, so this is global cropland, right? But how much of this global cropland is actually feeding people, right? And you can now start seeing some patterns here that will make this make more sense for you, right? Because you see that these are areas that are normally cultivating crops for feeding people directly, right? And these are areas that are cultivating crops for feeding animals. Right? So you see that most of agriculture in Europe, in the North America, also in South America increasingly, is not feeding people, right? It's not for supporting nutrition, it's for supporting animals, right? And you can understand now also how important it is to go a bit beyond these abstractions of farmland and all these things, right? So this is how it looks if we overlay it. You have a better understanding now. Why is it like that? I mentioned economies of scale, but I think there is a more interesting level to it. And the way, at least, through which the theoretical framework through which I try to understand it is by going back to world systems ecology and an understanding of value and how work, human and more than human, produces value. Because obviously, these are all profit landscapes, right? What is the source of profit and why did they end up being like that based on this profit extraction logic, right? And Jason Moore here helps us understand a bit the profit source of these primary production areas, which is basically the work of more than human agents, right? So imagine agriculture. We don't have that many farmers anymore. We mostly have tractors and plants, right? The plants are doing some work. The cows are doing some work. It's a different thing to say, oh, I'm not paying my workers enough. And it's a different thing to say, I'm not paying nature at all, right? But what is the problem? When you are not paying nature at all, nature sets a limit of how much nature can work for you, right, for free. And this is where the operational landscape idea comes in. When you have a farm and you just cultivate it and it's fine, you have some cows, the manure returns to nature, the metabolic system is closed, you don't really overexploit it, right? So it sets some limits. But what happens when you want to go beyond this limit? You really need to start investing some inputs, right? So the nature has a certain capacity to contribute this free unpaid work, after which you have to start paying for it, right? You exhaust the land, you need to add fertilizers. Fertilizer is not free, right? You have to extract probably value from somewhere else to create the fertilizer, to put it in the land that you now exhausted. Right? So the operational landscape is a landscape that is somehow operating over capacity. It's a landscape in which nature's capacity to contribute unpaid free work is exhausted and you have to keep paying for it. I think there is no better example probably than to look around us, the landscape in the Netherlands, right? If you stop paying for this landscape, it's going to be completely transformed into something completely else, right? It will not serve us at all, right? If you stop investing in fertilizers, if you stop investing in the infrastructure of the landscape, it will not be productive in the way we expect it to be productive, right? The same with the landscapes that I presented before in the Corn Belt, in the Midwest. So this is, for me, an interesting way to think about the spatial logic of it. And if you follow this, you can actually start rethinking these cycles in ways that help us understand how you basically extract value from one cycle and move it to the other cycle, right? Think of the whole fertilizer revolution, for example, as a way of complementing the lost fertility of the soil through basically natural gas, right? Nitrogen fertilizers, the input for the nitrogen fertilizers is natural gas, right? That's why it became also very expensive now with the gas crisis. The last thing, and I will close, as a theoretical experiment, because I really like this idea of the hinterland of hinterlands, right? We are used to thinking of the supply chain of things as having humans as the consumer, right? And we have here a map of population density, of humans, of distribution of humans, right? And normally we start, with the cow, and we end up here in the supermarkets and the retail and the processing, right? But what happens before the cow, right? So what if we look at the population distribution of more than humans? And on this map I have with different colors. So this is our view of the world, right? And we're kind of familiar with it. We know that somehow India is very populated, and Asia, Europe also is very populated, the coast of the US is very populated, right? But this is an image of the distribution of livestock. Livestock meaning, cattle, swine, poultry, animals that we use, right? And these also live in very different densities. And the change in their densities also changes the spatial logic of their footprints, right? So this is a big skyscraper, right, in China, right? Now we're starting to urbanize also pigs after poultry, and also together with cows, right? And this is the food landscape that supports human. This is somehow the feed landscape that supports these animals. And obviously, doing it also in a historical perspective helps us understand how models that started mostly from the West, like, for example, the expansion of soybean production for animal feed ended up occupying a lot of very environmentally sensitive areas in Amazon, for example, and eventually rethink global trade as, through this framework of exchanging values produced through the free work of nature around the world. And I have here just an overlay of some of the layers that I showed you. So the populations of the more than humans, the areas, the mountain areas, so for example, the areas of feed production, and these are main transportation lines, especially connecting things in the global south. So thank you very much.